with us this morning. He wanted to be here. But he was part of he was leading the first group of envoys to the US. And the major task of that delegation was to explain to our partners in the US South Africa's position. Explain what active non-alignment means, explain why we took certain positions in the UN, explained in detail what our explanations of vote meant, and that you shouldn't just look at the X's in boxes, you should be looking at what are the principles that we outline when we explain the positions around being pro-peace, anti-war, and why we needed the space to engage in negotiations. We found that there was appreciation from this within our counterparts within the US. We met with all the major players in the White House, the State Department, Pentagon, the intelligence services, and really had in-depth discussions, some of it which we obviously can't share here, but just to say that it was reasonably successful. We also engaged with American business around issues pertaining to AGOA. And interesting that from the business perspective, what they were more concerned about was that while we have preferential access to the US through AGOA, we also have trade agreements with the competitors in Europe. So it was really market-related, trade-related matters for them. And we then wanted to ensure that non-trade-related matters then impact on the manner in which AGOA is discussed going forward. So I think that was important to just underline. The envoys will continue their work, but this time not just to the US, they'll be going to talk to all the G7 countries, essentially to continue to explain South Africa's position, and now also the African Peace Initiative and the principles that I've just outlined, why these are important to guide any peace negotiations. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, Tyson, and then we can engage more in the question and answer session.
Thanks, DJ. I'll be the only one clapping for you. Thank you very much, DG. Just one or two takeaways from that. One, the historic nature of the Africa Peace Mission. I don't think there is a time in history where you had a group of 7 African heads of state intervening in a conflict outside of the continent. So this was historic, one. Two, the active non-aligned position that South Africa and a few other countries took has now been vindicated in that it has allowed South Africa to have convening powers. The G7 countries now acknowledge this. Because of your active non-aligned position, you're able to be received in Kiev and in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Some of them can't be received in those two capitals because of the positions they've taken. So our position, which was initially criticized, has now been vindicated because now we are actively part of moves to find a solution to this crisis. Being invited as an African country to the meeting in Copenhagen by the G7, including Brazil and India in that meeting and Turkey, is no mean feat. So I do think that these are matters that require reflection, even by analysts. And I'm glad, DG, that you touched on the work of the special envoys of the president, which continues to be ongoing work. Zahir, you want to comment? You will take questions. Okay, excellent. We can now then receive South Africa's BRICS Sherpa.
Well, and with that said there from the chief of diplomacy, public diplomacy that is at the DIRCO, let's move into this conversation next. An announcement that was made yesterday by the presidency that Russian President Vladimir Putin will...
Sherpa will be like a deputy Sherpa. So he's the BRICS Sherpa. Professor Ambassador Anil Suklal, who I'm sure all of you are familiar with. If you don't know him, let's have coffee outside. Ambassador, please.
Good morning. Good to be in your midst again. We last had this briefing 5 years ago when we chaired BRICS in 2018. I think much of our chairship is out in the public domain. There's been several press conferences about South Africa's chairship of BRICS. You are familiar with our theme that we chose, the continuity that we seek in our chairship, which started in 2013 when we chaired BRICS for the first time. Cabinet was adamant that BRICS taking place on the African continent can't be just about BRICS. It has to encompass the development agenda of Africa. So from 2013, we started this trend of making sure that Africa's interests are also championed within the BRICS grouping. And that's part of our foreign policy. One of the key pillars of our foreign policy is to champion Africa's development agenda 2063. We did that again in 2018, and that's why we chose as continuity the theme of BRICS and Africa, partnership for mutually accelerated growth, sustainable development, and inclusive multilateralism. Now we are over midway through our chairship, and we had set out hosting something like 200 meetings. We have been quite successful thus far in terms of the calendar of events in hosting the various meetings at various levels, ministerial, at expert level, as well as senior official level, that has been taking place on all three tracks that we that contribute to the totality of the BRICS architecture. The first track being the intergovernmental relations. That's where our ministerial expert groups meeting take place. The second track is the private sector, our BRICS Business Council, the Women's Business Alliance, BRICS Think Tank Council, the Academic Forum, and track 3 that pertains to people-to-people interaction, our civil society structures that are also meeting shortly. So we have been, I think, quite comprehensive in taking forward continuity with regard to BRICS. Now, if you unpack our theme, it tells you what our priority is. And as you know, when you determine the theme during your presidency, it's done collectively. BRICS is a consensus entity. It works by consensus. And even though we are in the presidency, after we have formulated our theme and our deliverables and priority, this is taken to our BRICS partners. And this was done in September last year. As is traditional, the incoming chair, the foreign minister, on the margins of UNGA, will host a foreign ministers meeting of BRICS countries, where we would then put out our theme, our deliverables and priority for our chairship, so that we have an interactive discussion and take on board the views of our other BRICS partners. And our theme was endorsed, and so were the deliverables and priority on which we are focused. Now, partnership between Africa and BRICS, why is it important? All 4 BRICS countries have strong bilateral relations with the continent, and they also have dedicated partnerships. China, the China FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Forum that has been there for the past 2 decades plus, the India-Africa Forum Summit that has been there for a decade plus, the Latin America-Africa Forum that has been there for the past decade and a half, and of course, shortly, the second Russia-Africa Summit is taking place in St. Petersburg, where South Africa, our president, will participate. So on a multi-level engagement, BRICS is quite involved in Africa, and South Africa felt that it's important during our chairship we use this period to also fast-track Africa's development, and our focus has been specifically on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and what is it that we can do jointly with BRICS in terms of engagement between BRICS and the AFCTA in taking forward that agreement for the benefit of both Africa and our partners. And that's part of the vision of the Agenda 2063 and AFCTA. Secondly, of course, you would see that on deliverables, the Women's Business Alliance has set as one of its deliverables creating a WBA Africa platform, and that's going to be launched when the WBA has its meeting on the 20th and 21st of August at the ICC in Durban, and that's one of the key deliverables. Some 15 African countries are attending that, so the Partnership also provides this opportunity to create a platform for at least the SMME sector and women in business through this alliance. Also looking at setting up the BRICS Africa Just Energy Transition facility that we have been talking about. As you know, the issue of just transition in terms of energy is quite critical for all of us, and BRICS countries each have their own programs, and how is it collectively that we can cooperate in this, and how is it that we can also incorporate Africa into this process. So there are other key deliverables. We will sign a customs agreement between ourselves that has been negotiated for quite some time. I was just at the Youth Summit that started this past Monday, and the youth are very keen. What we have not done within BRICS is formalize the youth stream. And under our chairship, we hope to formalize this under the leadership of Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and the NYDA. We finalized a concept note that was approved by the Interministerial Committee about 2 weeks ago. That's being discussed now at the Youth Summit. And on Friday, the youth ministers will meet in Durban under the chairship of Minister Zuma, and we are hoping that will be endorsed. So that will be another key deliverable, that we have a formalized youth track within BRICS, and I think that's a very important development as well. I've spoken very generally about some of the deliverables. There are several others that we are busy with at the moment, creating the Industrial Competencies Center. We have been working with UNIDO on this for quite some time. Industrialization is key for South Africa, key for the African continent, and key for all of the BRICS countries, so a major focus on that as well. Also looking at the future of education and what is it that we can do given the challenges of new technologies and the opportunities that it provides in terms of the future of education, especially with higher unemployment rates that we have amongst our youth, and what is it that we can do collectively in addressing both the challenges and the opportunities as BRICS countries working with the global community. Now, in terms of the summit itself, as DDG Moniela pointed out, there has been major focus on South Africa's chairing of BRICS this year, sometimes for the correct reasons and sometimes for the wrong reasons. There's been major focus on two areas. Firstly, the attendance of President Putin within the context of the ICC warrant, and secondly, the discussion around BRICS expansion. There has been much focus on these two key areas. On President Putin, as you know, the announcement was made by our president that he will not attend the summit physically, but he will attend the summit virtually. He'll be involved in all of the sessions where the leaders are partaking in the traditional summit of BRICS leaders on the 23rd, on the 22nd, when BRICS leaders of August, when BRICS leaders address the business forum, the closing plenary of the BRICS Business Forum. President Putin will also deliver his remarks virtually. He'll participate on the 23rd in all aspects of the summit virtually. And on the 24th in the BRICS Plus, BRICS Outreach Summit, he will also participate in that. So although Minister Lavrov will be physically present, President Putin will be involved in all deliberations of the summit. Now, this is not unusual. As you know, last year, at the G20 in November in Jakarta, President Putin didn't attend. Again, it was because of his consideration for the good relationship that he has with Indonesia and President Widodo. He didn't want to collapse that summit because there was a threat that if he attended the summit, Western leaders would walk out and the summit would collapse. Now, it was his consideration that he wanted Indonesia to have a successful summit. He did not participate. He sent Minister Lavrov. And again, I think the agreement that we have reached as BRICS countries in terms of this challenge that we had to address as South Africa, being a party to the Rome Statute and the presence of President Putin in South Africa and the arrest warrant, our president, I think, has done extremely well. He's engaged all parties, not just President Putin. This decision wasn't taken just between President Ramaphosa and President Putin. Over the past several months, our president has engaged with all of the BRICS leaders on several occasions. He has spoken to them several times, personally, discussing this issue. As I said, BRICS is a consensus-based entity. And President Putin not being physically present in the summit impacts all the other leaders as well. And I think it shows the maturity and the strength of the partnership, that collectively we could come to a decision that yes, President Putin understands the dilemma that South Africa faces, but he didn't want to jeopardize the summit. He didn't want to create problems for South Africa. And this is the strength of BRICS cooperation, that we could have this kind of maturity and solidarity in this relationship and ensure that we have a highly successful summit in South Africa with his participation virtually, and that all of the issues we have set on the agenda is discussed collectively, and we are confident that the summit will be a success. There's no threat of walkout by anyone. Unlike the G20, all of the BRICS leaders will fully embrace the summit, and so will the leaders of the Global South, in the form of African leaders and the major political heads of the Global South bodies that have been invited to attend the summit. Now, in terms of the summit itself, as you know, it's being held at the ICC in Sandton from the 22nd to the 24th of August. On the 22nd is the business forum. The leaders will address the closing session from 2:40 to 3:40 that afternoon. And that evening, we will have a BRICS leaders retreat. Now, this is unique to South Africa. The only retreat that took place was in 2018 when we marked the 10th anniversary of BRICS, and South Africa put on the agenda that we should review the journey we have traveled over the past decade and the way forward. We're doing this again this year, being the 15th anniversary of summits. And BRICS is a young organization, but I think it's established itself firmly as a powerful voice of the Global South on the global stage. At the recent foreign ministers meeting that took place, where some of you were present in Cape Town on the 1st of June, Indian Foreign Minister Jay Shankar pointed out that BRICS is not a new organization. It's been on the global scene and interacting on global issues for the past decade and a half. So it's firmly established. I think the important point to also remember is that the summit follows a certain pattern. So following the retreat on the evening of the 22nd, and there's no agenda item. It's a free discussion amongst the leaders to reflect on any issue on the global landscape. On the morning of the 23rd, the summit itself takes place starting at 10 a.m. As is the traditional format, you have a closed session where just the BRICS leaders deliberate on sensitive issues, and they also get a report from the chair of the National Security Advisors. In this case, South Africa's chair is Minister Ntshavheni. That meeting is taking place here in Johannesburg next week, where all of the National Security Advisors are going to be present. Following the closed session, you have an open session. Now, the open session is attended also by the other entities of BRICS. We'll get a report from the BRICS Business Council on their activities and their vision for the future. The same with the Women's Business Alliance. Now, given that the WBA was only formed in 2020, this will be the first occasion for the WBA to reflect on what they have achieved and the progress they are making as the Women's Business Alliance. We'll also have a report from the president of the New Development Bank, that is traditional, being a institution established through the decision of the leaders. And as you know, we have a dynamic chair that has taken over the presidency of the bank recently, former President Dilma Rousseff. She's going to be present and give us an update on the report, on the activities of the NDB. Interestingly, 2 months ago when the NDB was reviewed, all of the major credit rating agencies did not downgrade the bank, and its ratings remained intact as AA+ and AAA by the major rating agencies, and the bank has been doing very well. For the first time, we're also incorporating a report and participation of youth. It's not happened before, but we believe that we need to invest in our youth, and it's important that our youth are also party to summit proceedings. Following the summit itself, there'll be a press conference, a joint press conference of all of the BRICS leaders, and the afternoon is set aside for bilateral meetings. That is traditional. The evening, President Ramaphosa will host a dinner, but preceding the dinner, you will have a cultural performance at the Gallagher Estate, and thereafter a dinner. It will be a combined dinner. The BRICS leaders together with the leaders from the African continent and the global south. Now, as you know, President Ramaphosa took a decision to invite the entire African continent to the outreach and BRICS Plus, as well as all of the political heads of the major global south bodies like your G77, NAM, ASEAN, CARICOM, the Pacific Island Forum, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and so forth. So it's in total about 69 leaders have been invited. So this BRICS summit is it is the largest in terms of the outreach. You've never had such a large outreach. The largest outreach was again in 2018 when we had the entire SADC present, as well as about 10 leaders from the global south. One may ask why this decision was taken. It's because of the representation from global leaders calling upon President Ramaphosa, saying we want to be at the summit. And I think that again demonstrates the confidence, the vote of confidence that the global south has in BRICS, and not just the global south. I think you also would have seen in the public domain that President Macron has asked to attend the summit as well. And BRICS has always been inclusive. Although we champion issues pertaining to the global south and addressing the major fault lines that exist in the global geopolitical, geofinancial, and economic architecture, almost 80 years after the UN and these institutions were formed, we have never said we do not speak to the North. We engage with the global community in terms of addressing common global issues to create a more inclusive, equitable, and just global order. So you can see that there's high interest in the summit, and the BRICS Plus and BRICS Outreach that is set for the 24th of August starts at 9 and continues till about 4 that day, given the large number of leaders that is expected to attend. That will bring the summit to a close, so it's over a 3-day period. Preceding the summit is an official visit by President Xi Jinping. As you know, we celebrate 25 years of formal diplomatic relations between China and South Africa this year, so it's an appropriate opportunity to celebrate that milestone. And post-summit on the 25th, there's an official visit with Prime Minister Modi, because we also celebrate 30 years of formal diplomatic relations with India, and that's also an occasion to reflect on the strong relations we have also with India. Colleagues, I think that's been a very broad sweep of the issues. Very quickly on expansion, because I know you're going to ask questions on expansion. Now, the issue of expansion was put on the table by South Africa for the first time. As you know, we are the first beneficiary of the expansion of BRICS. We were not there when BRICS was founded at summit level in 2009, when the first summit was held in Yekaterinburg in Russia. Nor were we there the following year when the second summit was held in Brasilia. But South Africa felt that we should be part of this configuration. And us joining BRICS enriched BRICS. As much as we benefited, BRICS also benefited, because you could not have a global south body that excludes the African continent and expect to be effective. And I think BRICS realized that, and that is why they invited South Africa at the end of 2010 to join as a full member of BRICS, and we did so when we attended the Sanya Summit in March 2011 in China. Now, in 2018, we put out a concept note to our BRICS member states to say perhaps we need to look at BRICS expansion, because this knocking at the door of BRICS is nothing new. It has been there over the years, where countries have been formally approaching us saying they want to become BRICS members. But at this summit, the BRICS leaders decided that we needed to consolidate it further, the grouping and the cooperation between ourselves before we look at expansion. But last year, under China's chairship, at the foreign ministers' meeting in May last year, the foreign ministers raised the issue of expansion, and they had an initial discussion. And at the summit in June last year, the virtual summit under China's chairship, paragraph 73 of the Beijing Declaration specifically speaks to expansion, where it states we should start discussions around BRICS expansion, and we should look at developing guiding principles, standard criteria, and procedure for expansion through the Sherpa track. So that was a mandate given to Sherpas, and when ministers met in New York in September last year, they had an initial discussion and urged us to continue the work tasked to us by summit last year. When we took over the chairship in January this year, we placed a great deal of emphasis on the task given to Sherpas around expansion, and we had several meetings at the level of Sherpa, and Mr. Jobe in the back, the Sous Sherpa, chaired several meetings. When the ministers met on the 1st of June, I provided an update on where we are in terms of this discussion. They were not satisfied with the progress we made, and they asked us to convene a special Sherpa meeting before mid-July and finish our work. We did that 2 weeks ago in Durban. We convened a Sherpa meeting where all countries were present, and we did get consensus on the 4 areas we were tasked to discuss. That has been now taken to our foreign ministers, and this afternoon Minister Panda will chair a virtual meeting of foreign ministers to reflect on our recommendations around the 4 areas of guiding principles, standard criteria, and procedure, and the larger question of modalities of expansion. So we'll await further direction in terms of what is happening around expansion. 22 countries have formally approached BRICS countries to become full members of BRICS. There's an equal number of countries that have been informally asking about becoming BRICS members. And I think this again demonstrates, as I said earlier on, the confidence that the BRICS leadership has shown over the past 15 years since it came into being at summit level. DDJ, I think I will leave it here.
Some of the names of the 22 that you can remember?
Yeah, they are all the major global south countries like Argentina. I mean, they cover all the regions of the world, from Latin America to the Middle East to Asia as a whole, Europe as well. And of course, I think there's no area of the world where a country has not formally asked. From the Middle East, the major Middle Eastern countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, UAE have asked to become a member. Countries like Bangladesh was already a member of the NDB. As you know, we admitted 4 members to the NDB as full members in 2021. So the list is in the public domain, but all the major players are from the global south. They're quite weighty countries. And I should point out that BRICS is not a counterweight to the G7, as sometimes we read in the press that we are a counterweight, that we're in competition. BRICS was never created to compete against anyone. BRICS was created as a positive force for global good. Thank you.
Right. So the question I thought you would ask has been answered. That President Putin will be participating at the summit virtually. And Ambassador Suklal also went through the genesis and the historic, or rather the history and the build-up, the consultations that took place prior to the announcement made yesterday. So please ignore the trolls on Twitter and the jokes around the coincidence of one of our former presidents being in Moscow and the announcement. There is no link. And also some political party claiming that because they went to court, this is why. It is not true. Ambassador Suklal has spoken to how we got. In fact, we've known for a while that President Putin won't be coming. We just didn't make the announcement because certain consultations needed to take place. You can take that to the bank. And also, I forgot to introduce, there's a very tall gentleman at the back who should be playing basketball. That's Ben Joubert. He's the BRICS Sous Sherpa, so he's deputy to Ambassador Suklal. Welcome, Ben. Okay, I think now we can take questions. You know the drill. There is a roving microphone there. Yeah, let's get your questions. Let's go, Patience. Let's start at the back. Don't you want to start at the back?
Good day, my name is Tando Mayagwen. I'm from the Business Day. Just on the expansion and the interest shown by 22 other countries to join the bloc, does South Africa think that it's under pressure from other African countries for it to push for African countries to be included into the bloc and not only South Africa? And if it is under pressure from the African countries, how is it managing those expectations? Thank you.
All right, we're noting that question. Let's get another one. Yeah.
My name is Johannes Dietrich from German newspapers. Guten Morgen. It's a question for the Director General. That if it's so clear for South Africa that the territorial integrity has to be maintained, why did South Africa never criticize that Russia didn't maintain the territorial integrity and even kind of withdrew a statement from DIRCO that exactly mentioned it?
I can answer that question quickly. That statement was never withdrawn.
It was never what?
Withdrawn.
But
Somebody said we withdrew it. He
was
lied.
withdrawn.
Not.
So it's still, I mean,
It's still on the website. Let's start there. Okay, let's get another question.
Lisa Gatano, Mail and Guardian. Just to the DG, you spoke of maturity that has been shown by President Putin. Yet, not so long ago, you actually had to go to China to ask the Chinese to co-host with you. Not so long ago, the President of Russia actually refused your suggestion that he participate virtually. So where is this maturity? I mean, in terms of Russia, do you not, to some degree, feel that Russia did put South Africa in limbo? And Clayson, when you say that you've known for quite some time, how long have you known that President Putin was not coming in? Why weren't we, as the public in South Africa, not informed about this? Just in terms of the 69 leaders, Prof, that have been invited, how many of those are from Africa? And if you could just list some of the countries in Africa. Thank you.
Okay. So all the heads of state on the continent have been invited. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's Zianda Ngobo from Newsroom Africa. My questions are tied to my colleagues as well. But insofar as the envoy that was sent, was the recent high-level delegation to the United States in any way a contributing factor towards Putin not attending? Was that part of the discussion there? And linked to what Lizega was asking, then, some would say if you are maintaining your non-alignment stance, then why didn't you just take it to China so that you can accommodate President Putin whilst also maintaining your obligations with the Rome Statute? And just slightly to veer off, but possibly linked, I mean, we know that the US ambassador to South Africa spoke about arms that South Africa allegedly supplied to the US, yes, Clayson, and that Lady R investigation, my understanding is that it is done. Was this spoken about during the trip to the US? Is it true that the Americans spoke to the delegation about recalling Ambassador Brigitte over those claims that he made? And the last one from my side is, do you think that the decision by President Putin not to attend the BRICS summit could make South Africa's pleas to retain the AGOA benefits more palatable to the US now? Thank you.
Do you want to answer, or can I take more questions? They're sort of linked, hey. So I think we can take two more. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much. Anita Hansen from News 24. I just want to refer to a really serious statement made in a confidential or formally confidential affidavit that President Cyril Ramaphosa admitted to the Gauteng High Court, where he basically said that he believes there's good reason that Russia could go to war with South Africa should they arrest Putin. I mean, can you just, DG, speak into how does South Africa maintain a cordial relations with a country it fears that it may what the president said in his own word, launch nuclear missiles, number one. And number two, if you could just talk about this maturity that you speak about of President Putin of not attending, that seems like polar opposite statements by the President of the Republic telling the High Court that we're actually scared that Putin may go to war with us if we arrest him. And then on the other hand, there's an attempt to say all was well, and we know for a very long time Putin was not going to come anyways, and like he didn't attend the summit in Indonesia. So please can you reflect on the contradictions in that regard? Thank you.
Mamkwena, you'll be the last for this round.
So Femkwena from the SABC. There's a strong view from Brazil. I've monitored a statement from Brazil in particular since President Lula took office that he wants to revive IFSA, the South-South cooperation, because he feels strong that yes, BRICS, but you have fewer countries. If you really have to ensure that you have this multipolar world, but also you have this balance between the developed North and the developing South, you have to strengthen the South-South cooperation. I know that within the governing party, at their conference, which is now a policy position, they also feel strong that you should strengthen the South-South. Then you can have a more balanced world, because that will include transformation of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, the international financial systems, including your IMF and your World Bank. What is South Africa's position? And I have a strong view and feeling that this is likely to be his message at the summit. So perhaps the Shepherd can guide us on that, and the DG. The second question, in relation to the DG's statement, or yes, I think it was the DG who said when you compile those 10-point plans, you took into consideration other initiatives such as the 12-point plan of China, the Brazil, and you spoke about the European one that led to the recent meeting that you spoke about, the one that Ukraine is more comfortable with. Are you intending, as Africa, the African Peace Mission, to meet with heads of state of these initiatives, like your China, your Brazil, and leaders in the West, to then consolidate a document that can be accepted by all stakeholders, that can be presented before the two leaders, that can pave way for negotiations? And then the other question on expansion, perhaps you can share with us the proposed criteria in terms of this way of ensuring that other countries are accommodated, and their modalities.
All right.
And then on President Putin in particular, the Africa Summit next week, what can we expect?
We expect you to go, Sophie.
On behalf of South Africa, what is South Africa's message to the Africa Summit?
Sure. Okay, so for colleagues who are on Zoom, the next round I'm going to start with you for questions. So I have not forgotten that you are in the room as well. But before I ask my seniors to answer, Juanita, can you consider these two issues on the question that you asked around the statement made by the President in his affidavit? One, senior people in government in Russia have said this, that any attempt to arrest their president is a declaration of war. This is on record. So the president mentioning that again is not being dramatic or anything like that. Secondly, there's no precedence in history of a sitting head of state being arrested in a foreign country. So if you do that, you've got to consider that all options are on the table for that country whose president you are arresting. If you link the two, the statement from Moscow, plus this precedence I'm talking about, our president saying that in his affidavit is being pragmatic in my view, and it does not take away the maturity with which this file has been handled. As I said, and I don't have permission from them to mention this, when the president was in St. Petersburg as part of the Africa Peace Mission, he had a bilateral with President Putin. So we knew, as far as way back then, that President Putin wouldn't be coming to Johannesburg. No. I'm answering. Can I answer? Can I answer? So, and even prior to that, there's been several engagements as the DG was. Juanita, this is not the way to conduct a conversation. So the point I'm making is the two are not in conflict, the two statements that have been made. There's a lot of maturity in how this has been handled, but also what the president said is very pragmatic if you consider the two issues I've alluded to. Ambassador Suklan, you want to go first or the DG first? And maybe let me not go too far.
So I'm going to deal with the non-BRICS matters. Anil will deal with that, but I'll deal with some of the ICC-related matters. So the discussion that was just the subject of your interaction. So the reason why, and I think it's worth noting this, because the reason why the document, the affidavit was tagged as confidential was it was on the insistence of the ICC that is done. Article 97 consultations that we were part of, we in our statements then, when we made our opening statements in the consultation, said all these discussions we feel are in the public domain and we don't have a problem with it being confidential. The pre-trial chamber insisted we did note verbals and they answered with note verbals, so they insist that it be confidential. And that's, I think it's important just to note that very, very quickly. So as soon as the warrant of arrest issue became public, Cabinet had meetings and deliberations. We had legal opinions about what the legal obligations are, and options were then put on the table, none of which included the physical participation of President Putin. And these are the options that were then engaged with and discussed over a period of time. One of these options was that another BRICS country that does not have that's not a state party may be able to host. It was an option and was discussed at length with leaders. Another one was a fully virtual meeting that was also discussed with BRICS leaders. Another option was the one that is finally been arrived at, where you'll have almost hybrid situation, where you'll have a senior representative of Russia participating physically, with the president of Russia participating virtually. That was the option. So these were the options that were necessary in terms of building consensus. So none of the options ever had the idea that we would be in breach of our national and legal obligations. And we made that point over and over and over again. We made this, I've made this in the media, the president, our minister, that we would, whatever option is finally agreed to, would be in keeping with our national and international legal obligations. So, the idea that why didn't we say this in the papers or that in the papers, that was not the issue that we were being asked to answer. We were being asked to answer about arrest, which is a completely different issue. But that court case is on. There's a hearing tomorrow, so I'm not going to engage in that anymore. Okay. So I just wanted to repeat what Anil said. So this has been part of discussions for a while. And of course we would be discussing elements of this with other partners as well. when we engage with the EU, the USA. We would be engaging not necessarily on the substance of what the answers are, but we would be reiterating to them our respect for international law and compliance with our obligations. It's a point that we made very vociferously in our 97 consultations with the ICC in The Hague as well. I'm only mentioning this now and breaching the confidentiality issues, and Romy, our legal advisor, is looking at me as a stop. But because we are under compulsion to respect that confidentiality. And the court decided otherwise, but that's, so, but I thought it's important just to mention that it wasn't a frivolous action. It was one that we had to do. I think we've answered the question about, you did answer the question about the threat. But I also need to point out that big powers have done that consistently. You have what is called the Hague Invasion Act in the US, where they literally state that if the ICC arrests any of their nationals, they will take whatever means necessary. I don't know what the actual act is called, but that's the nickname for it, is the Hague Invasion Act. So big powers generally do not respect extraterritorial jurisdiction that they are not in control of. The ICC provides a more common approach to extraterritorial jurisdiction. It provides countries like ours with certainty around process. We don't agree with everything that happens in the ICC, but at least it's better than victor's justice approaches through ad hoc tribunals. And this is why we remain a member of the ICC, to also reform it. And part of what we discussed with the ICC was, our approaches to Article 16, referrals and deferrals. We're not going to go into all of that now, but I think it's important that we mention those issues. I think that also answers the question about non-alignment and China. I think we had all the options, and it's not about being non-aligned, it's about hosting BRICS in a manner that's consistent with our national and international legal obligations. And that's what we've arrived at. The Zianda's questions about Ambassador Brigitte and Lady R, I think the judge is very jealous about questions and answers on Lady R. There's a process that's been underway. People have been interviewed and asked to provide evidence. The judge and team will make their findings known. They may need a bit more time because I don't think they've gotten all the evidence that they've requested from the different stakeholders. That's all I can say on that at this stage. The announcement that was made yesterday, it was part of the kind of discussions that we've been having with stakeholders. We may not have been explicit about what may happen in the end, but what we did explain was we will not do anything that is outside of our legal obligations. And they clearly understood what we meant by that. Okay, so when we engaged as envoys in the US, we made those points over and over again, and they understood it. I don't think that there's been any discussions about the withdrawal of the US ambassador, not at least in discussions that I was party to or that I was briefed to. I think the US ambassador has made his apologies, and that's it. We continue to engage further.
But he never retracted, so...
Yeah. Ambassador Brigitte can speak for himself. Okay. Just checking what are the other issues that the IPSA issues. I don't know if I do think that IPSA is important for us. I do think that the idea that we need to revive IPSA is something that we share with Brazil, and we've discussed it recently as well. There has been a suggestion, I don't know if it's been confirmed, that the heads of the three, of India, Brazil, and South Africa, will meet at the margins of UNGA to discuss ways of strengthening IPSA. So that is on the agenda, and it's something that we share with President Lula as well. Yeah. And then on the peace plan, so we did look at all the peace plans. We looked at what's the best out of all of them. We looked at the commonalities, what are the principles implicit in all of them. So you have the African Peace Mission, but part of what we discuss with other actors is how do we broaden this initiative? You can't have a major negotiations that deals with peace architecture, for example, in Europe, that deals with a broader global peace architecture that doesn't include China, for example. You need China at that table, and everybody, actually almost all stakeholders agree with that. So we are engaging with them and others to look at how we broaden out the base of countries and experts who can facilitate the peace talks. So we are looking at expanding it. But obviously, we must also take into account who President Zelensky and President Putin would be comfortable with. These are very, very real concerns. I'm just going through the list, and Anil, you'll deal with some of the BRICS-related matters. Yeah, I think the question from Johannes on the territorial integrity issue. So I think, and Zahir, you can correct me, but at least two of our explanation of votes at the UN explicitly spoke about respect for territorial integrity, including that of Ukraine's. We've been saying that in our formal explanation of votes. We've also said in some of our media statements. We're very particular in protecting those elements of the Charter. What we've also spoken about is our concerns about notions of humanitarian intervention and how that has been abused in the past. We see that with Libya, Syria. We look at the Kosovo issues. So there's a lot that we've been speaking and writing about our respect for territorial integrity in Ukraine and other places. In that sense, we've been a lot more consistent than many of the other players in the international arena, particularly also about the use of force to annex land. We've been consistent, whereas others may not have been that consistent.
I think the question was that why doesn't that adherence to that principle require you to condemn it at the UN the way other countries did when it's violated by a country like Russia?
The condemnation in terms of the resolutions.
Yes.
If you look at the wording of many of those resolutions, and what we were concerned about is to what extent would the wording of those resolutions lead to a process where you can engage towards peace talks. What we would do is, some of these resolutions, the very early ones, we didn't agree with the wording. The subsequent ones we engaged with. But in many cases, when it came down to telling the South African delegation, it's a take it or leave it text. It's not something that we can accept very easily, because we would engage in the spirit of negotiations, wanting to change and shape text in a way that would be more inclusive. But when you tag text as take it or leave it, but notwithstanding, our abstentions were never no's. Our abstentions were yes buts. And the yes buts were then explained in a lot of detail in the explanation of votes. And if you see the explanation of votes of Brazil and China, very similar in terms of the issues on territorial integrity. What we didn't agree with is that you have a set of resolutions that was polarizing the global community rather than seeking to unite them. And if you polarize, then that convening power gets lost.
Thank you. Sorry,
yeah. Sure. Cool.
Your question was helpful. That's why I allowed it.
I think that's, if I've missed anything.
Yeah. Ambassador Sukla? Then we'll get to the people in the Zoom meeting.
Thank you. The question of expansion is not unique to BRICS. Expansion is something that every organization has to deal with on a consistent basis. The EU started with 6, they went to 28, they're now 27. ASEAN started as 5, they're now 10. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization just admitted Iran now as its 9th member, having started out with 5. And as I said, this issue of expansion on BRICS has been on the table. There's been call for expansion of G20. As you know, we're lobbying, South Africa included, for the African Union to move from an observer to a permanent member of the G20. So if we are lobbying for the AU to join G20, why should we feel pressure if other African countries, should we expand BRICS, want to be part of BRICS? We would welcome that. We'd welcome that. So there's no pressure on us or any BRICS country. It's something that every organization has to deal with it. The question is, does expansion add value to the organization, or does it devalue the organization and take away from what the organization has built over a period of time? I think every organization, the EU included, when they were expanding from the 6 to the 10, 15, 20, 28, and so forth. In terms of, there was never a time we said that the summit is not going to be held in South Africa. We kept engaging and we kept reiterating. There was repeatedly in the press that South Africa is hosting the 15 BRICS summit. We never went to China and say we want to do a virtual summit. Of course, we are looking at all options. But these were part of the ongoing work of the team that President Ramaphosa appointed under Deputy President to look at the challenges faced in terms of us hosting this. So there's much speculation in terms of this. And all of the leaders, and South Africa included, our chairship this year is after 3 years of virtual BRICS chairships. And all of them said we must get back to physical meetings. And that is why all of our tracks, from Sherpa meetings to expert groups to ministerial, the majority, 90% of these meetings are physical. And we were quite certain that we will host a physical summit here in South Africa. Now, someone questioned the use of the term maturity. I use that very pointedly. There is a sense of maturity in the way BRICS leaders interact with themselves and the way they arrive at consensual decisions. Now, with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war, all 4 of the BRICS leaders, and DJ Dango alluded to the African initiative, the 12-point peace plan by President Xi. Prime Minister Modi has been doing shuttle diplomacy between Zelensky and Putin on an ongoing basis. Lula has been doing the same. So there's a concerted effort by the BRICS leaders to find a negotiated, peaceful settlement. And on the other side, we see very immature behavior by leading countries in terms of fueling the war through their actions, in terms of their utterances, threatening behavior to smaller countries, South Africa included, intimidating behavior, taking away certain privileges and so forth. That's not how you conduct international relations as members of the United Nations, where we respect each other, and the very principles of the Charter speaks of creating a world where we work in collaboration with each other, not using threats and intimidation. You haven't seen that from BRICS leaders. On IPSA is alive and doing very well. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the founding of IPSA this year. And yes, Lula has been one of those that has been on the forefront to say we need to further energize IPSA on its 20th anniversary. The chairship passed over earlier this year through a formal meeting between foreign ministers from India that has held the chairship to Brazil. And Brazil has put out an ambitious program of action, some 20 activities that's planned. And we have a Sherpa meeting upcoming, IPSA Sherpa meeting. We have our traditional foreign ministers meeting on the margins of UNGA, where we release statements expressing our collective views on key multilateral and global issues. You have IPSA-MA, the IPSA naval exercises that take place every 2 years, that is alive and kicking. The IPSA Fund for Poverty and Hunger Alleviation has to date spent over $35 million on over 30 projects in all parts of the world, millions. If you just Google the IPSA fund website, you will see the impact the fund has had, and it has won several UN awards from the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, which administers the fund, and the Secretary General himself has cited the IPSA fund as being a new paradigm and a new model of development cooperation. So IPSA is there, it is alive, and there is talk of a summit either later this year or early next year that President Lula wants to host. On the issue of expansion, the criteria, standards, and so forth, as you know, as I said, there's ongoing discussions at the level of ministers. So we made recommendations as Sherpas. It has to be considered by ministers and then ultimately by President in terms of the recommendation ministers make to the heads of state. So it would be premature to discuss that in the public domain as yet, because our presidents have not even seen it. Our ministers have just received it from us, and they're going to deliberate on it today. I think I have I've covered all of the issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Zoom, can we get questions? I cannot see your hands, so they will help me. Oh, there are no questions on Zoom. The people on Zoom are very peaceful. Shall we start at the back again?
Good morning, my name is Saeed. I'm from Phoenix TV. I've got two questions. My first question is to His Excellency, the DG. You spoke about the African mission to Russia and Ukraine. And just last week we saw the NATO summit has decided, concluded last week with the NATO insisting on expanding. So I just want to, as South Africa part of this African mission, what is your view on this? The second question for Prof. Sukala, it's been, the talk's been about the expansion of BRICS and as well as the President Putin, whether he's participating or not. But we didn't hear a lot about what's the economic gain from this summit, or what's the geopolitics. Maybe you can just give us more context. Thank you.
By the way, when you're talking about economic benefits, I need to acknowledge a good friend, member of the BRICS Business Council, Mr. Nicholas Stavrov, who's just walked into the room. Welcome. Should we get more people there? Coming this way?
Yeah, hi, Steve Woodward for ZDF. I just want to know what South Africa's stance is on the...
Okay, can we just get a bit of volume there?
Steve Woodward, ZDF. Can you give us South Africa's position on the Ukraine deal which has just expired?
Okay. CNN.
Thanks very much for doing this. David Mackenzie from CNN. I have a question for the DG, which is a follow-on from some of my colleagues. There has been criticism from Western diplomats that South Africa is saying it's neutral, but acting that it's not in this conflict. I won't go through the laundry list. You've probably heard the accusations. What is your response to those diplomats who say South Africa is saying it's neutral in the conflict, but acting like it's not? Thank you.
One more question on the grain deal, and in particular, what does South Africa see as a permanent solution? Because the President has said he wants a permanent solution. And what does Russia's suspension just days before the Russian Africa Summit say about the credibility of Russia's engagement with the Africa Peace Mission? Thank you.
We didn't get the name.
Joseph Kostrel of the Financial Times. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Eugene Do, the Asahi the Japanese newspaper. Question to the Professor Sukla. Since the criteria for the expansion is not yet reviewed by presidents, so is there no possibility in this summit that leaders will announce the new member of BRICS in this meeting? Thanks.
Okay. I think we should just do all the questions because I don't think we're going to have a third round. I have to release the DG and Prof at some point.
Turkmen Terzi representing Turkish Unit. My question for Ambassador Supla. We have been covering the BRICS summit since beginning 2013, and the main agenda was the business and BRICS. You joined BRICS as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, and all African countries they came here. But within years, you found yourself in a hot seat, and you hosted military exercise with Russia and China in this deep south. And so I'm going back to discussing the real agenda of business in this summit. Thank you.
Okay, there were two more hands this side. Here, in front.
Thank you. Hi, it's Kate Bartlett from Voice of America. I have a follow-up question on the Lady R. I know you say the judge doesn't like you to speak on it, but it seems there's been a contradictory response from South Africa on the ambassador's allegations. On the one hand saying, no, absolutely not, we did not supply Russia with arms, and then setting up an investigating committee. If an investigating committee needed setting up, does this mean that it's possible that the president, the foreign minister, the head of the army were unaware that arms were onboarded?
Okay. All right. That's another question.
Hi, Claire Bargeles for Radio France International. Just shortly on the wish of President Macron to attend the summit, how open are the BRICS members to this idea?
I think it'd be nice to have him here. Stay, why are you so quiet today? What happened? You haven't had coffee? My word, this is unlike you. Okay, I think that covers all the questions. One more. At the back, let's give the gentleman a microphone there.
It's via Zoom.
Oh, it's via Zoom. Okay. Oh, do you want me to read the question? Gabriela from the Wall Street Journal, can you please update us on discussions on a potential BRICS currency? How far advanced are the talks, and what would be the purpose of such a currency? Where does this come from? Okay, we'll deal with that. I just want to be sure that we don't have any more questions, because I don't think we want to have a third round. Very good. DJ, you want to go first? Yeah, for the cameras. Lights, camera, action.
So there's a couple of things I'm going to mention, then I'm going to ask Zaire to come and talk about, just to follow up on it. So on the NATO expansion issues, I mean, we're concerned about generally what a European peace architecture would look like. But that's something for Europeans and NATO members to discuss, and hopefully to engage with others around what that would look like in the future. But we cannot determine what NATO thinks it wants to do or not to do. And Zaire may also want to just comment on that. But I think in terms of discussions on a regional peace architecture for Europe, that's an important discussion because it's got global impacts. On the grain deal, we're disappointed with the fact that it's not continuing, and of course we'll engage with Russia on this, and we're doing this in the context of the G20 as well. So there's ongoing discussions with various partners on this particular issue, and hopefully we'll also through the G20. As you know, all the BRICS members are also members of the G20. So South Africa's footprint in the global stage is quite significant, but we're also engaging with the grain deal and also to look at a permanent solution. There's no agreement on that yet, but hopefully quite soon. On the non-aligned approach, I think that actively non-aligned is one that we consistently explained. Some diplomats have initially felt that it was the military exercises that they brought into question, the Lady R matter, which I'm not going to answer in the way that you've asked it, because I do think I want to respect what the judge has said. different sets of facts, different sets of allegations, and we should leave it up to the panel to assess the evidence, information at hand, and make a finding. It doesn't help us to try and speculate when there's not a lot of information forthcoming. Yep. So here I think yeah.
I hate to be rude, but what is your response to Western diplomats who say South Africa is saying it's not aligned, but acting that it's not?
So we've been engaging with Western diplomats, and we engage with Western diplomats every day. We engage with diplomats, including Ambassador Brigitte, on a regular basis, and they actually do understand the fact that when we say we're actively non-aligned, and we explain why we're actively non-aligned, they accept it. Some of them would actually want to put pressure on South Africa to take a particular stance, and it becomes very useful to try and corner us by saying, but you're actually not neutral. And we've explained that neutrality and being non-aligned are two different things. Being non-aligned to big powers, and in the context of geopolitical wars and conflicts where we don't want to be pulled in, doesn't mean that we don't take a position on issues such as unlawful use of force and those issues. That is not what non-aligned means. And we explain that, and we're quite consistent in explaining that. And I think most of our more serious interlocutors have accepted that. You know, whether it's the US State Department, our counterparts in the UK and the EU, at least I've engaged with them quite recently, and they accept that South Africa is genuinely concerned about ending the war, finding ways of bringing people together to ensure that we have meaningful discussions to end the war. And we're doing that from a stance of being non-aligned, which again allows us to have that convening power that we spoke about. I want to say just to amplify a couple of those issues. And
Just one point. Thanks. Thank you, DG. Good day, colleagues. I think I wanted to touch on the issue that's coming up in the context of South Africa's approach and perhaps what has been said about us not strongly condemning one side or the other. And we should ask, what is the objective of the international community? What is it that we should be doing? And from our perspective, it is to end the war and to work towards long-term peace. Ultimately, that should be the objective. By our words and our actions, we should be leading towards an end of the conflict. That would save lives, that would end the challenges that we have on food security and energy security, etc. So the assessment that we've been making is that since last year, since February last year when this war began, the approach that has been taken by many Western states, by and large, has been essentially to condemn Russia and, in a way, to isolate Russia. I mean, what we see in international fora, in the multilateral engagements that we've been engaging on in various forums, whether it is on issues pertaining to global health, issues pertaining to education, issues pertaining to nuclear weapons, what we see is a failure for us to work together and collectively to address the challenges that we face. So essentially, this isolation of Russia, this almost like this cancel culture that we've embraced, which is to push out as if we don't want to engage with a particular country, has seen almost a breakdown to some of the collective actions that we should be working towards to address the various challenges we face as the global community. We're going to be working towards a COP in the UAE later this year, addressing issues pertaining to climate change. We need to work with all countries to address these challenges. So as South Africa, we've taken the approach of engagement. We've taken the approach of stating principles, approaches on international law. As the DG has stated, if you look at the statements that we have delivered in the UN General Assembly and in other multilateral forums since February last year, the issues of the UN Charter, which stresses the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity, has been something we've amplified. The issues of consistent application of international law. When we talk about a rules-based international system, it is about the consistent application of international law. This is something we have consistently stressed. It's something that we have raised. The presidents have raised this in their engagements when the African leaders engaged with the parties when they visited Kiev and St. Petersburg. This has been the approach that we've taken. Condemnation, isolation, has that brought us closer to peace? No. But engagement is something that perhaps would be a much, from our perspective, an approach that would lead us to bring the parties closer to the negotiating table. The advantage we've had, and I think this has been raised both by Clayson and also the DG, that the advantage that South Africa brings to the table, and it's not just South Africa, our BRICS, some of our BRICS partners like Brazil and India have that advantage as well, is the ability to be able to be received. I mean, what you saw with the African Initiative and the leaders going to Kiev and being welcomed. I was personally in Kiev with the delegation. We were, despite what you may have seen, we were welcomed and received by the authorities in Kiev in a very cordial and welcoming manner, in that they saw this for what it was, a group of leaders from a continent that is affected by the conflict, that have come to engage and seek solutions towards peace. The same in St. Petersburg. So having, and Clayson said this, having a group of countries that is able, and South Africa being part of this, that is able to engage with the one side and literally hours later go to the other side and engage. There are very, very few countries that can do this. And the question then has to be asked, if we had taken this approach of condemnation, of, and as I've said, we have stated consistently the importance of compliance with international law, the importance of abiding by the UN Charter and respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity, specifically of Ukraine. We've said that in our statements, and you can look back and look at that. But if we had taken the other approach, would we have had opportunities for countries that would be able to do this? And I think this is something we would want to stress. I think I'll end there. I think the DG spoke about the grain deal. We are supporting the efforts of the Secretary General. This is something very important. The UN has played a key role in this regard. And from South Africa's perspective, we do hope that there will be an opportunity for the parties to work together with countries like Turkey that have been working on this deal, and importantly, the UN Secretary General, to find agreement on this very important issue. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Basar is there? Yeah.
The question on the economic and geopolitical benefits to South Africa as being part of BRICS, you would have seen in April this year that in terms of PPP GDP, BRICS now account for 31%, 31.7% more precisely, of global GDP, as against 30.5% of the G7. And Goldman Sachs, who coined this term, BRIC, has stated that by 2030, BRICS will account for 50% of global GDP. So BRICS is not only a powerful force of the global south in terms of trying to change the fault lines in terms of the global geopolitics, but it's also changing what is happening in the economic space globally. The recent spring meetings of the IMF World Bank revised downwards global economic growth, but it pointed out that 70% of global growth this year will come from Asia, powered by India and China as the two fastest growing major economies. While others in Europe, some have gone into recession, some are growing at 0.5%, USA is expected to grow at 1%. India at 6.5%, China at 5.96%. So being part of this group has major economic benefits. Just to give you statistics, in 2013 when we hosted BRICS, our total trade with BRICS was 340 billion. In 2022, it surpassed 800 billion. Now just in terms, and that figure rivals our total trade with the EU, 27. Also in terms of investment, in terms of...
Just repeat that figure, others missed it. 2013 versus 2022.
340 to just over 800 billion.
Yes.
That will give you perspective in terms of the value of being part of this group. Now, of course, China is the second largest global economy. When the G7 was found, China was 10% of the US economy. China was 163 billion, US was 1.6 trillion. That was in 97. Today, the gap between China and the USA is less than 10%. USA 25 billion, China 18 billion. India was not even in the top 20 economies. Today is the fifth largest economy, having overtaken its colonizer. And will continue to grow within the next, before 2030, the prediction is they'll be the third largest global economy. In terms of foreign holdings, China is first, India is fourth, Russia is 7, Brazil is 10. So that will give you some idea of the gravity of these countries and the economic benefit it brings to South Africa and Africa as being part of this group. Of course, also appreciating our relationship with Europe and the USA as important partners, important investors into South Africa's economy, not to belittle that they are important players in our economy. We value that relationship as much as we value our relationship with the BRICS countries. I think that's important to note. The geopolitical issues, I've covered that. What we are trying to achieve. I mean, take the words of UN Secretary General at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. He said that the Bretton Woods institution and the UNSC is in drastic need of reform. He specifically, I want to quote him, I don't want to misquote him. He said these institutions are outdated, dysfunctional, unfair. This is coming from UN Secretary General. And this is what BRICS said it is. If you go to the first BRICS summit, go and look at paragraph 7 there and what we say about creating a multipolar world. In 2009, we were talking of a multipolar world. And I think that's what BRICS has been saying. We want a more inclusive world. We don't want hegemons determining how we act and how we behave on the global front. In terms of announcement of new members, of course, we can't preempt what ministers are going to decide. It's, as I said, it's an ongoing process. There will be some discussion and mention within the what we are referring to as the Goli Declaration, because we couldn't go back. 2018 was the Johannesburg Declaration. 2018 is the Goli Declaration, and I'm sure there will be mention of the issue of expansion. It has to be following last year. I'm not sure what will be said there. I don't want to preempt Minister Pandor and the BRICS foreign ministers in terms of what they are going to be discussing and what leaders will ultimately decide. But it's an important issue. Let me not forget, of course, the role of the BRICS Business Council. Stavros is here. And the BBC was launched by South Africa. It was our initiative at the 2013 summit to create the BRICS Business Council, and that's become a powerful force. Stavros, maybe you want to say something in terms of the work you're doing, and more recently the Women's Business Alliance. Military exercises we conduct with everyone. Operation Mosi was the second edition when China and South Africa and Russia came together. We do so, I just refer to IPSAMA. IPSAMA has been going on since the founding of IPSA. We conduct military exercises with countries throughout the world. This is how partnership, it's not unique to South Africa. And why pick on certain military exercises when others happen, we don't even mention it anywhere in the public domain. President Macron, Minister Colonna, when she was here last month, formally asked Minister Pandor that and conveyed France's desire to attend the summit. But as I indicated, BRICS is a consensus entity. It's not South Africa's decision alone. This has to be consulted, and Minister Pandor is busy with that process. There's never been talk of a BRICS currency. It's not on the agenda. It's not on the finance stream. But what we have done, we've signed an inter-BRICS agreement between our banks several years ago, trading in local currencies. Yeah. What we have said, and we continue to deepen, is trading in our local currencies and settlement in local currencies. This is not unique. As part of advancing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, under the leadership of the Africa Exim Bank is in place. 8 central banks are party to that to date. 20 commercial banks are party to that. That's the initiative of Africa, to have greater financial flexibility and independence to trade in local currencies. So BRICS started a process that has been expedited as a result of the conflict, as a result of unilateral sanctions, including financial sanctions, that countries want. The days of a dollar-centric world is over. That's a reality. That's a reality. We have a multipolar global trading system today, far different from a trading system of just 20 years ago. And that's why Guterres is saying all of these organizations are obsolete and dysfunctional, and we need to reform this. And that's what BRICS stands for, reforming the global architecture to be inclusive and for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stavros, yes, please. Member of the BRICS Business Council.
Thanks very much, DG and colleagues from DIRCO, members of the media. This is a little impromptu, and really just to supplement and complement what our DIRCO colleagues have been saying. I think let me just in 30 seconds place some perspective on the BRICS Business Council and who we are. We're a 25-person council, of course 5 representatives from each of the chapters. Each of these council members have been appointed by their respective governments, all through the Ministries of Trade, Industry and Competition, or our counterparts who have slightly different names. In the instance of South Africa, the way the council, or the 5 council members have been appointed, we are all nominees of either Business Unity South Africa or the Black Business Council. We then get vetted and appointed by Minister Patel in this instance. Let me just make two supplementary comments to both what the DG and the 2 DDGs were saying earlier. And that is to say that as a business fraternity in South Africa, of course, we see extensive promise and opportunity with BRICS. I know there's been extensive debates on, do we get value out of BRICS? Are you better off being inside or outside BRICS? Well, I think the numbers and the statistics tell the story. I'm not sure that I really need to go into a lot more detail, but anything that represents in excess of 30% of global GDP has to present an opportunity. Of course, these opportunities we would like to translate into industrial activity, job creation, economic growth, and I also think importantly, we should never understate or underestimate the skills and the technology transfer opportunities. So there's that element as well, which is very important. The council is, if you want, an oversight organization. The real work, if I can call it that, DG, we just do the talking at the council. The real work is 9 working streams, soon to be 10. I won't cover extensively what they are, but they cover those areas in the economies of these 5 countries and beyond that have been identified as potential trigger points for either collaboration, economic or industrial, or as trigger points for growth. So they include sectors such as agriculture, agribusiness, financing, infrastructure, manufacturing, etc. So these are the 9 working groups represented by all 5 countries in BRICS and chaired by, in this instance, by South Africa. And of course, we will hand over the chairmanship at the appropriate time to our colleagues in Brazil. Just lastly, because I don't want to hog the mic, that wasn't the intention here, DDG Clayson, but let me cover, because I've given an indication around the economic potential that we see within BRICS, whether it's the 5 countries of BRICS or the expanded version late at some future date. There's no doubt that you're better off being part of something that occupies that extent of global economy and will grow extensively into the future. It doesn't mean that as a business community in South Africa we are only demonstrating interest in BRICS. Of course, we look at it as an opportunity wherever there is economic growth potential and wherever our interests reside as a country, the business community, that is where we tend to place focus, emphasis and resource as well. So talking about resource, the business community is backing the BRICS Summit. We are backing, of course, the opportunities that reside. We are not drawn into any of the geopolitics or any of the political discussions. Our focus and our mandate as provided by the government is very much to focus on economic collaboration. And lastly, where are we as a council placing our focus now that we have the chairpersonship? It's in 3 areas, and I think this is a very important comment coming up. The first area is we've seen a 44% growth from 2017 to 2021 in BRICS trade. We are, however, a little concerned as South Africa on some of the uneven trade statistics. So we do run trade imbalances in certain areas, and part of what we are going to try and engage on and have started engaging on already and expect it to be an area of focus is evening out some of these trade imbalances so that our people here in South Africa, small, medium and large business, are able to be beneficiaries. We are not going to do this in a reckless way. Put differently, we need to export more finished products rather than raw materials and import less finished products from elsewhere. So it's very much about that, and it's about evening out these trade imbalances. The second priority is, of course, we are the fulcrum to the rest of the continent. The Business Council has been seized with doing roadshows in Africa to the business communities in Africa, and in particular, you can expect and invitations have already been sent to African business people to attend the business activities of the summit. Lastly, there is an opportunity, of course, that we continue to profile our country as an important and relevant investment, economic, trade, business and commercial destination, and this provides an opportunity again to highlight and flag that particular aspect. There are all told 32 business events that will take place around or at the time of the summit. So the first one I think starts on the 15th and the last one ends on the 25th. So we've got a jam-packed business program, all of which speak to enhancing and promoting economic trade and investment between these 5 countries. There are a number of side events. I'm a bit, DG, a little biased in this one, but and this will be my last comment and I'll take my seat thereafter. But I've spoken more than the DG, it's a bad sign. The issue around global pandemics is very close to the heart of President Ramaphosa. You would have seen he raised it recently again in Paris, and there is going to be a side event on pandemic preparedness and recovery. It's going to be one of the flagship side events. We are expecting finance and health ministers, both from the BRICS countries and also from Africa, to be in attendance. It's a particular area that South Africa has demonstrated leadership and championship in. Our president remains the COVID champion on the continent, now being converted to healthcare champion on the continent, and I think this is an excellent opportunity to continue driving that healthcare championship agenda, given the vast inequality that exists in healthcare systems, goods and services across the world, but particularly on our continent. Thanks very much.
Very good, excellent. I want to acknowledge the acting Deputy Director General responsible for the Middle East and Asia, Ambassador Zodwa Lali, sitting at the back there. Welcome.
I also want to take this opportunity to then thank the DG for making time for this important engagement. Professor Sukla, thank you for making time, Zahir. Thanks for making time. Our colleagues at GCIS, Reba Lloyd, thanks for the support. And then, of course, the most important people in the room, the editors and the correspondents from the various media houses, both domestic and international. I'd like to thank you most heartily for accepting our invitation and for pitching and having this robust engagement. Hopefully, we've answered a few, if not all the questions that you had, and helped to change a bit of perception here and there on some matters that were not so straight. Hopefully they are now. And this is an ongoing engagement. We'll be inviting you to Pretoria this time. We won't be coming to your neighborhood, but thank you ever so much for coming through. So this is what's going to happen. We're going to break for lunch. After lunch, there will be another briefing which is more focused on the logistics of the summit at the Sandton Convention Center. We're going to have our technical people from both Gear House, the SABC, and our team will be briefing you on the movements of journalists, the media center, and registration, accreditation, all of those logistical matters. We'll unpack that in more detail after lunch. Am I leaving anything out? Sorted. Thank you very much, colleagues. Yes, sir. Are you gonna stay for?
We've seen, you telling me earlier on around some of the, people that would usually frequent the area, frequent your business, especially the bakery, to get their goods in the morning. But this has not been the case right now, as we really don't know even in terms of how long this operation here is going to take. Welcome to the SABC.
Hi, thank you very much. I actually kind of agree with you on that last point that you made with regards to